We're going to get started, so please take your seats. Just want to welcome everyone to the third day of State of the Science, and I'm very excited to introduce our two speakers this morning, Lucas Shumaker and Kelsey Leonard from the University of Waterloo, and they will be giving the plenary this morning on best practices regarding Indigenous engagement within the offshore wind industry. Welcome them, please.
Good morning. I'm Lucas Shumaker from the University of Waterloo. I'm an undergraduate student in environmental engineering, and I'll be presenting today.
And I'm Dr. Kelsey Leonard, Lucas' supervisor. Akwe Onikasek. I'm also a Shinnecock Nation citizen from this territory, and really happy to be here with you all today.
So I think to get us started, to situate ourselves in sort of the background of why we've been doing this research and then also why this is necessary. There is a necessity to transition to renewable energy. We understand this, but to make sure that all impacted communities are a part of the discussion is also a necessity. For terrestrial wind farms, there are many injustices faced by Indigenous communities. One of these instances is in Norway's wind farms at the heart of Sami land, and they have faced a lot of different injustices that we've seen over time represented again and again. This is also an issue in offshore wind, as we have offshore wind being developed on Indigenous ancestral waters, and this can be seen in some of the research that has been done in energy justice and the co-opting of Indigenous narratives in U.S. offshore wind development. This article focuses mostly on the developments that have happened in the Cape Wind development and Vineyard Wind in Nantucket Sound and Martha's Vineyard, and these projects both have sort of a co-opting of Indigenous narratives and sort of that somewhat of a lack of Indigenous engagement in some of these projects. So to understand a bit of where we're coming from, we need to understand what Indigenous energy sovereignty is. And Indigenous energy sovereignty, a good definition of this we found was from the Energy Sovereignty Institute. The Energy Sovereignty Institute defines Indigenous energy sovereignty as the right for Indigenous peoples and tribal nations to make their own decisions about energy generation, distribution, and consumption. That comes into play in energy justice. So what is energy justice? To understand the necessity of Indigenous energy sovereignty, we need to also understand what energy justice is. And this article, Energy Justice and Conceptual Review, has three main tenets of energy justice. So we see distributional justice, recognitional justice, and procedural justice. So distributional justice is how resources are allocated and distributed, not only where infrastructure is, but also the access to energy being produced. Recognitional is how individuals and groups are represented and works for fair representation, including work against not just failure to recognize, but also misrepresentation. And then procedural. So procedural is how decisions are made and the processes by which these decisions are made that affect distributional and recognitional justice. This also includes access to the decisions being made and how these decisions are being made. And then in this paper, they discuss how energy justice includes not just the inclusion of energy governance, but also asserting Indigenous energy sovereignty and providing First Nations with decision-making authority over their unceded lands. So to sort of dive into energy justice, Jenkins et al. Asks us to consider these questions, which evaluate the distributional, recognitional, and procedural justices that are all a part of energy justice. By evaluating these questions, we can understand what is being overlooked and how to move forward.
So this now leads us to a conversation on Indigenous energy justice, transferring across the literatures to say that Indigenous energy justice is about how we as Indigenous people assert our rights to design, implement, and manage energy systems, ensuring control over our lands and waters, while also being able to challenge historical injustices, affirming our rights of free, prior, and informed consent, and working towards a framework of restorative justice. This is a concept that I put forward with other colleagues in a recent article called Pluralizing Energy Justice. If you didn't notice too, you can have your phones out. The QR codes are scannable if you want to find these papers. So when we're thinking about what are these principles of Indigenous energy justice, it really looks at aspects of healing and temporal justice, responsible energy development, the right of free, prior, and informed consent, regulatory and legal reforms, right? We can't just talk about all of these things. We love conferences where we come and we get to see old friends and have great conversations and talk a lot. But that actually has to lead to action. It has to lead to transformative, fundamental shifts in the way that we do things. And hopefully that allows for reconciliation and restoration, both of human interactions with our environment, but of the environment itself. And so when you're thinking about Indigenous energy justice, it includes all of these different principles. And two that I want to really highlight here are the aspects of healing and temporal justice. There are aspects of energy colonialism that have led to intergenerational trauma for Indigenous peoples across the planet, but particularly in this part of the world where you sit along the Atlantic Ocean. And we have to be able to address those traumatic experiences, both historical and contemporary, through a lens of decolonizing temporal scales. We can't just push because we need to have a transition. We need to do so in a time frame that recognizes people's trauma and the harm that they've experienced. So with that, that leads to, what are we looking at in the context of Indigenous energy justice in offshore wind?
So, Indigenous energy justice in any project includes free, prior, and informed consent. But what does this mean for the offshore wind industry? So, to start, consent needs to start before the project, be freely given, and communities need to fully understand all implications of the project. So what do? We created a framework for Indigenous energy justice. So this will provide guidance in consulting with Indigenous nations and communities throughout the offshore wind development process. We titled this Implementing Indigenous Energy Justice throughout offshore wind development, a free, prior, and informed consent framework. So how did we create this framework? Where did we start, and how did we pull in these ideas and create them into one document to sort of reference? We started with the Free, Prior, and Informed Consent Due Diligence Questionnaire from First Peoples Worldwide at the University of Colorado Boulder, and from this, we adapted it to specifically look at the offshore wind industry and address offshore wind specifically instead of all development projects. We then adapted the Just R metrics for considering energy justice in early stage research, and these provided insight into different aspects of energy justice that we may not have considered, such as a lot of the waste management or carbon amounts or the costs of some of the energy justice and energy research being done, and also the energy projects going forward. This collectively created our framework, but what does the framework include? So our framework includes 6 parts. Part 1 is it's analyzing current policy commitments. This part explores our existing policy commitments that are related to human rights and Indigenous peoples. It also includes internal policies and considerations of United Nations human rights principles, as well as land acknowledgements. Part 2, identifying the impacted Indigenous peoples' benefits and costs of the project, includes covering an understanding of the Indigenous communities living in or near offshore wind development areas, the impacts that these communities may face, and the benefits and costs of the project regarding the impacted peoples. Part 3, Project Impact Data, reviews what kinds of information and data need to be collected before collaborations with Indigenous communities begin. It also includes providing plans for impact mitigation, environmental impact assessment guidelines, and information on material usage. Part 4, engagement with the goal of reaching agreement, ensures that public participation is equitable, accessible for all impacted communities, including providing materials in multiple languages, documentation of the engagement process, and evaluation of the inclusion of under-recognized groups. Part 5, Agreement and Post-Agreement Relationship Management, discusses public consent and potential grievance mechanisms. And Part 6, Implementation and Assessment, reviews the implementation of the framework and how to use these metrics as an evaluation tool. So these are a part of a framework, and along with developing this framework, we created metrics to evaluate how well the framework worked and how well a development sort of could follow the framework. This also allowed us to understand through the metrics what could be improved within the framework. There are also 5 metrics categories, and these categories align with the 5 first parts of the framework.
Okay, so for this project, the particular geographic scope is, as you can see here, we're really looking at the Northeast Atlantic up from Maine all the way down to South Carolina with the existing projects that are there. So projects investigated included Empire Wind, Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind, South Fork Wind, Block Island Wind, and Vineyard Wind 1. Which I don't think there's a hand that would not be raised in this room that didn't hear about the incident that happened over the weekend. So with that, though, we don't want to publicly shame any one company, because hopefully this is company or project. This is really about how do we learn together? How do we build a society where everyone is benefiting from these projects and not being disproportionately impacted? So our approach to hopefully accomplish that was to create an aggregate. So the paper actually analyzes the aggregate of these existing projects we have in our society today and creates a fictional company and project called Average Wind.
So to create Average Wind, we evaluated all 5 of these companies on our list of metrics. We have 43 metrics that we developed to evaluate the framework, and each one looks like this, with a good designation, a needs improvement designation, and a poor designation. And each of these designations has guidelines on what is necessary to achieve that designation. This also just determines whether the project, where the project scored, and then this was averaged to create Average Wind. But what did our Average Wind company score based on these 43 metrics? They scored a 41%. Average Wind scored 41 out of the 43 metric, or 41% of the 43 metrics. So to break this number down a little, we're going to take a look at the distribution between our different framework categories. So if we look at this plot, each of the 5 bars aligns with one of the main metric categories. We can see that the worst performance was in parts 4 and 5, engagement with the goal of reaching agreement and post-agreement relationship management. The best was in parts 1 and 2, analyzing current policy commitments and identifying the impacted Indigenous peoples' benefits and costs of the project metrics. But the majority of the metrics that were scored poorly were the ones that could lead to greater transparency throughout the whole process. There were also some metrics that we were unable to collect data on because we couldn't find them online. This primarily consisted of the environmental data and project impact data, which would fall into category 3, which may be why it has more of an average score. The other thing is that our best parts in parts 1 and 2 are primarily the parts that are required by the government. So a lot of the data that was provided for those parts are things that are already required.
So, we come back around to this idea of Indigenous energy justice, free, prior, and informed consent. So what we found in reviewing average wind was an absence of life cycle assessments for emissions, resource use, and costs. It was very hard to find information on the entirety of the life cycle, including waste. There also was an absence of grievance mechanisms. So our estimation of this is that this perhaps may lead and enable coercion and harm because we're withholding critical information and data, and we're not allowing for mechanisms for dispute resolution when there is a grievance at hand. Prior, there was minimal evidence of engagement with Indigenous peoples prior to the project approval. So although, as the prior plot graph showed, folks are identifying impacted Indigenous peoples, they might be sending a letter or an email, but they're doing it after the lease area has already been granted. They're doing it after the turbines are already being constructed. They're not doing it before, and that matters. Informed. Minimal public disclosure of data and documents, pre, during, and post. It has to be across the whole life cycle of these energy systems, and we're not seeing it. And lastly, consent. No explicit consent by Indigenous peoples for offshore wind was found across Average Wind or any company. Consultation is not consent. And for all those in this room that may not be aware, the National Congress of American Indians last year issued a moratorium on all offshore wind off the coasts of North America.
So, where do we go from here? Our first conclusion is the necessity of collaboration. We want to work with these offshore wind developers to understand how the framework can work for them, and we also want to see collaboration between industry for working together to create best practices overall. And then we also need knowledge sharing. We need to learn from rights holders, stakeholders, and industry about the challenges that each face to work together in bridging the gaps that currently exist. And then there's change. Knowing that in learning and collaborating with others, the result must be action and change of the status quo. We must continue to work to make changes that benefit everyone in all phases of these projects and the energy transition. Thank you. I think it's time for questions.
All right. So remind folks, just use the app to upvote the questions, but as they come in, just maybe real quick, you spoke about kind of the actionable items that we may need to do to improve this. Can you speak to just one that we can implement today or tomorrow that might have a huge benefit if someone who is wanting to engage with Indigenous nations but just may not know how in a proper manner?
I don't know if there's one simple thing, because the whole all of it is very complex. There are a lot of nuances. I think that the first step to starting that process is education. Start by looking into, especially for offshore wind developers, start by looking into the lands which you're building on, the waters that you're building in, and start building those relationships in Indigenous communities. Start talking to the people. Start doing that before the project starts, and continue that well after the project is sort of completed as well.
Yeah, I think Lucas said it very well, and as we eventually share this framework more publicly, we hope that's why it was created. We hope it can be a starting point for those that are like, what do I do? There's 43 different areas that you can start in and work towards. And it's not a checklist per se, it's about the journey that you're on, and it's going to be a continual process of engaging, quality improvement, maintaining relationships. That's the part 6. It's not just you get to an agreement, it's about how do you nurture that agreement, nurture that relationship. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is in the federal processes that are required and available to entities, they follow those for the timeline that they live, which might be a year, 5 years, but then afterwards, where these projects are supposed to live on for 30 plus years perhaps, there's no follow through. There's nothing of a strategic planning that comes beyond the short term of getting approvals and getting a project, generating. And that's where we have to start thinking with those refined temporal scales. What is the long-term commitment you're making to communities and to the environment when we're putting these projects in?
A question that has a lot of votes and is probably important too on the research is, have tribal communities commented on and or approved the framework you've developed?
Yeah, so we would like to reach out and be able to have Indigenous communities comment on the framework. We don't have any, I guess, official approval. I don't know. I don't think there's an official approval because, Indigenous communities are not a monolith. There's no one. Oh, yeah, we've been approved. But I think that there is definitely the potential, and we would really like to be reaching out to Indigenous communities to get feedback on the framework.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, the framework is a starting place. It's not the end place, and it's for folks to adapt, and hopefully it will be of use to Indigenous communities as well, but they're already doing the work. They're already screaming in the rafters. They're already shouting, as I've said, through the moratorium that was issued, all of these different things. So sorry to say it, the bad actors in the room are not the Indigenous folks. It really is other folks who need to educate and learn and build their competencies. And so the framework was built for those folks in mind. But it's a living document, so we are a part of the project that this is a part of has larger conversations with Indigenous leaders and nations across both Canada and the United States that are facing the proliferation of offshore wind. And so I'm sure at some point they will lean into the framework and provide their guidance. But there's a bit of hesitation, perhaps, of feeling like it's worth their time to continue to engage with the non-Indigenous community on offshore wind, because even since Cape Wind 15 years ago, folks have not been listening. And so at what point, when you're just shouting into an echo chamber, do you get really, really tired and despondent?
Thank you for that response. Pivoting a little bit, in the United States, it is the federal government who leads the environmental assessment. While developers clearly have a large and important role to play, could you comment on BOEM's role in obtaining free, prior, and informed consent?
Horrible. No, BOEM has really great folks, and they're trying to do good work, but we all know how the U.S. Government works, right? This is administration. We're in an election year, so your vote counts. You want to see Native people not be railroaded? You know who not to vote for in November. This is American politics. It's the history that we've been surviving through and being traumatized with for over 500 years. So is it BOEM's fault? I mean, BOEM are appointed leaders in many instances that are appointed because of federal administrations that everyone in this room and all your family members vote for. So yeah, we could blame Boehm, but I could also look at everyone here and your family members who vote for really horrible people that say it's okay to exterminate us and say they're just as much as fault.
If a regulator or a developer wants to do a better job of engaging with indigenous communities for an offshore wind project, where do they start? How do they determine who to reach out to? How do they best initiate communication? How do we try to move forward and work on this together?
Yeah, I think that, well, obviously this is not out yet. We don't have the access to the framework is not available yet. I would hope that in the future that the starting point would be to look at a framework similar to this or this framework when it is published. But yeah, I think that starting with, like I said before, just the education aspect, starting with the looking into what lands you're on, where the development is happening, and starting to reach out to those communities. I think that another part of our framework that we discuss lengthily in the actual document is the understanding of the indigenous communities whose land you are on and doing the research to understand how they provide free, prior, and informed consent and if they have their own way of providing that. So looking into if these communities have a way that is already available for them to provide that consent to developers. And that can usually be found online or by talking to the communities.
And I think real great resource I've been a part of, Marco and NROC, their data portals. They have all of the tribal nations in the region listed. For the other coasts across America, you'd have to look to the particular regional ocean partnerships there, but the West Coast has a great one as well. This information is all publicly available online. The reason we were even able to sort of craft this type of project because there is a lot of information online. So the other aspect is folks need to invest the time and the resources in their due diligence of doing this work. We can no longer say the information's not available. It's there. It's been there. You know, Marco and NROC have had the data information on their websites for Marco for probably 6 years, NROC and Marco with more updated layers in the past 3 years. So the fact that projects are still going forward and staff are like, I don't know where to find this information, also makes it seem like some developers and some projects need to have better competency training for their staff when they're hired. And that's a part of the framework as well, is a measurement of how you're training new folks when they come onto these projects.
I know we have a session right after this, but I'd like to just squeeze one more question in, and maybe you can help educate us. The question says, can you say more about what you mean by indigenous-led timescales so that we can start to understand ourselves how to meet you where you're at?
Yes, so as Lucas mentioned, Indigenous peoples are not a monolith. We use that term so that there's an understanding that there's many brackets underneath that of tribal nations, federally recognized nations, state recognized nations, unrecognized Indigenous peoples, urban Indigenous peoples. So Indigenous is a very broad term, and so there's not going to be one set time scale, but the idea behind sort of this decolonizing temporal scales is that the way in which we understand time as individuals in a society is culturally based and culturally informed. Think about, for some societies, showing up on time is being late. Showing up early is being on time. That is a cultural standard. So the same thing also applies for Indigenous peoples and different Indigenous communities. They have different understandings of the temporal scale, the time it should take for a project to move forward. They have different understandings of the lifetime, which then informs how you assess the life cycle of a project. You may be thinking of it in 30 years, and they may be thinking of it in 30,000 years. So if you never ask the question, what is your temporal scale? How do you interpret the time and the time lengths that we should be looking at when we're talking about these projects? You're not using the same language. You may be both speaking English or speaking Spanish, but you're not actually speaking the same language because you have different interpretations, but didn't ask.
So I don't want to cut it short, but we do have another session. But thank you very much for this excellent talk and starting to educate us and move us forward. Thank you.